Just a quick heads up, we had some serious technical difficulties with our recording software, and as a result, we're only able to capture the backup recording of this interview. Thankfully, we were able to capture it in full, but you'll notice the quality of the audio and video are not up to our usual standards. Still, we hope you enjoy this episode of Ways We Learn. You found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean, and I'm here with Joe and Brian. And I want to start out with a little background here. So in the business world, the notion of scale means expanding your operations and profit without sacrificing performance or efficiency. It's sort of a holy grail. Scale increases your profit margins and it increases your market dominance. And it's a really big deal for companies who get it right. Think Amazon, for example. Scale is also very difficult to accomplish, which is one reason there aren't a lot of Amazons. And so that's all talking about scaling operations. But workflows and practices come along for the ride when a company scales. And according to our guests today, an interesting finding in research is that almost every attempt to scale a practice fails. So this episode is going to be very, very relevant for anyone out there who's thinking about how to grow an educational business, where you need your teachers to teach the way you want them to teach, or really how to grow any business. So speaking of our guest, Mike Goldstein's professional adventures include building a learning lab for Q Math in India, building an academic team for New Globe Bridge in Africa, starting a charter school and tutoring core for Match in Boston, among other things. He and his wife, Prue, have 2 teenage kids who generally dislike his whole dad joke portfolio. However, here at Ways We Learn, we always appreciate a good dad joke, and so we hope that Mike will share many of them with us today. So Mike, welcome to Ways We Learn.
Hey, great to be here.
All right, Brian, over to you. You want to start us off? Brian, we're going to need you to come off of mute for that. This is why.
It's not like this is my first time either. So, Mike, great to have you. Great to see you, sir. So one of the things that we were going back and forth with you on email about, like this, I think we should just get down into like some specific cases and talk about scale, talk about like some of the things that you've seen. So you wrote in the email as we were going back and forth that an interesting finding in research is that almost every attempt to scale a practice fails, right? You said you can change a math textbook, for example, to align with Common Core, but then it turns out math achievement doesn't change. So what's happening in between these shifts? Like maybe just even in this one case, like what's happening when something succeeds and then what's lost as it tries to scale out to more and more classrooms and more teachers?
So, yeah, a couple things wrapped up in your question, Brian. So let's start with how are we deciding if something's succeeding or failing? So one way, a way that I anchor towards, is when you have an economist run a randomized trial that measures a control group against a treatment group. So for example, in the case of a math curriculum, you could imagine, Brian, that the economist says, all right, here's 20,000 kids that are going to get the new stuff, and then we've randomly chosen another 20,000 kids to get the old stuff, just like a drug trial. And then they're very good, these economists, at carefully measuring what happens. And a lot of times, what we see in the literature, they are the final and very unpleasant step where they say, okay, we've done all this research, and it turned out the kids who got the new stuff didn't learn anything more than the kids who got the business as usual stuff. That's the final step of what's usually three things. The first is somebody comes along, a bright entrepreneurial person, and says, I have a better way to teach math. Here it is. And they work on it and invent it and sort of fine tune it with a few kids. And they're like, okay, now I've got a product or a service or a training. I've got a something. Then there's this intermediate step. The intermediate step is you get it out there, let's say, to some medium-sized amount of people. Maybe it's in one school district, maybe it's a few hundred kids, maybe it's 10 teachers, but you build this little evidence base that says, kids are better off, they're learning more math with my new book. And so because there's enough enthusiasm at that point, it sometimes hits this threshold where a big funder or the government comes along and says, maybe you're really onto something great. Let's hand it off to a neutral party to study it at some scale. The question of why it breaks is its own question that the economists can't answer. All they can say at the time is that, hey, we looked at all these 20,000 kids and they're not learning more math. And from there, they usually in their paper, they speculate, Brian, about why it didn't work, but
Gotcha.
They can't concretely answer that with evidence. That one's more speculation.
A thing that I've always believed kind of related to this is that quality goes down with the number of humans that are interacting with something. Like just in general, I've noticed that. Is it? Do you think there's anything in the amount of humans it touches, or is it like, no, this happens with software, this happens with curriculum? Like where do you think about that?
So I feel like a common situation in most schools is that teachers are doing a number of things reluctantly that they kind of feel like, I'm going to half-ass do this thing because my boss told me I'm supposed to do it. And I'm going to combine it with the stuff that I feel like in real life works. So their mental model is, I'm doing a bunch of stuff every day with the kids, and some of it is like what I would do if left to my own devices. If I, for example, had my own micro school, I would do these things. I think these are the right things. And also I'm doing some stuff that like I'm being told to do. And what typically seems to happen at scale is a lot of teachers are coerced and told, you should do X. And the teachers don't necessarily either want to do it, but they also know that they're not really going to be held accountable for it. There's this like weird middle gray zone where they will say, if I kind of fake do it a little bit, nobody's going to get on my butt about it. That's enough because I don't even think this is a good idea. And so I think a lot of scale efforts break down because buy-in is low and accountability is low. And you need at least one of those things to happen for scaling to happen with fidelity.
So, first of all, anybody who's listening and not watching the video of this is not aware that we're all cracking up on this because we've all had this experience that Mike is describing here of we are trying to implement some kind of new process or better way of teaching or something like that, and there's varying degrees of buy-in, like you said. I guess why can you speculate on why that's so difficult? Because it seems like there should be a way, right? You bring in oversight. You say that we need to evaluate. We need to make sure that people are doing the thing that we're saying that they need to do. Why doesn't that work? Is it because it's too top down? Is it something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll give you, I think, two pieces of an answer. There's a scholar named Anthony Breich, who's a very celebrated guy in the K-12 world, whose main topic is called improvement science. So he looks across a whole bunch of industries and tries to bring those ideas to K-12. And one of his main theories is, Sean, the school systems are so complex that you need to embrace the complexity, and therefore, when you say something works broadly, That should just be a starting point where then you consider, does the host organism, does that school or school system or group of teachers or group of parents or whoever's on the receiving end of this stuff, do they really buy in? And there's no way to bypass that, if you will, locality. All you should do with R&D ever is try to see what works in your context and assume a lot of outside ideas you might try in good faith and they won't work. And I can't tell you exactly in advance why they won't work. All I know is a lot of times they won't, and it's better to have this humility about it. Just assume a bunch of interesting ideas like, hey, here's a better way to teach math. Here's a way to help literacy strugglers. Here's a way to implement ed tech. You can have a whole bunch of ideas that come in from the outside. Just assume most of them break on contact, but some don't. And your job is to discover what works in your context. So that theory is very unappealing, obviously, to everybody who wants to have widespread scale, right? Because it's like, well, that's unsatisfying. Yeah.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for a sec? When you're saying in your context, do you mean in the microcosm of that school, that teacher with those 20 kids in front of you? Or do you mean your context of within your school district? Like what level are you kind of thinking about?
So Tony is thinking as a scholar about various levels where he's thinking of the decision maker as the key thing. So that could be like, for example, the head of education in New Mexico, like a state commissioner. It could be a school district superintendent. It could be a school principal. It could be a math department chair with 4 other colleagues that are math teachers. It could be a loose confederation of all progressive math teachers. Like, there's a lot of different ways he thinks you could slice what the community is, but what they have is some status where they're organized either officially or sort of on a volunteer basis around a few common ideas or things. So that's the, either you have power over these people or you have affiliation power over these people. And so you're able to try things.
But I think one of the arguments, right, of this is that even though you may have power over the teachers in a classroom, you're the superintendent of the school, you're the principal, you're the whatever. I guess maybe the answer is you actually don't have power over over the
yes, Joe.
You think you do. Right?
I think that's it, right?
Organizational power, but not real power.
Or it's weird, like you have enough power where most teachers won't flagrantly disregard what you're saying, but neither will they fully embrace it. And so the number one story, when you look at like 100 studies of failed replications, hey, this worked in X place, now we tried to make it bigger and help more kids, and then it didn't work in the bigger version. And then they're like, why? And then the scholar says, we don't know, but it seems like there was an implementation problem. It seems like there was a buy-in problem. And I think that goes to your point, Joe. Do you really have power? Power would mean that they actually do. I mean, like, I think like last week you guys had like somebody from National Defense University, like the military, you have pretty high buy-in, not perfect, but a lot of times people are doing more or less what chain of command wants, and that's a lot less true in education.
Yeah. Right, and so
it goes to like every teacher thinks they have a secret sauce. That's the way that they teach math. If they do think that, which I think is pretty common, you try to come in with something new, you're going against established beliefs on how they should do what they're doing.
Yeah, one of my crazy, not so crazy ideas, Brian, is teachers loosely, to me, if you talk to lots of teachers, like, oh, you guys, they do identify into tribes of people who share certain beliefs. The problem is their tribe doesn't particularly overlap in the physical school where they teach. So you can go into an elementary school and it has 30 different teachers. And loosely, those 30 teachers might belong to 7 or 8 different pedagogical tribes of what they're trying to do with kids, what they believe. And if they were allowed to kind of join their group, it sort of within the school, it's kind of too small. Like you have a second grade teacher with a sixth grade teacher with a special ed teacher, and they're a little too far removed. But if they were allowed to join nationally with, hey, I'm the type of second grade teacher who believes in X, Y, and Z, they would actually then lean in and have a group of people with whom they're aligned, and you would have what Anthony Bright describes as like a learning community. However, a lot of school systems have tried to create these learning communities, and they get the same half-assed version of it, where from the teacher's point of view, it's like, oh my God, Brian, they told me I had to join this dumb learning community, so I have to sit there every Wednesday, and somebody's giving us professional development, and we're all like grading papers while pretending to pay attention, and it's false. So it's like lack of authenticity happens so much when professional educators are together that at some point they just throw up their hands, as you guys all know, and they just develop scar tissue here. Like, what are we really doing? I have to sit through a bunch of stuff. I'm willing to do that because it's part of my job, but it's stupid.
Right. And then you just get...
Okay.
Then you just get so jaded that I imagine the interest in ever trying anything else goes down and down and down.
I think that's right. And that's why you see a lot of, people who have long been trying to change teacher behavior themselves become jaded because they see that reaction. And it's sort of like a vicious circle, like the young up-and-comer teacher influencer people, or would be, over time become jaded about what's possible. And like certainly I've hit an age where I'm not jaded about it, but I do feel realistic about it. And that's why I sort of feel like, look, there's two extremes that are worth pursuing if you're trying to improve teacher practice, and then a big middle that's not worth trying, which is the normal way people try to do PD.
That resonates so much for me, because what you just described is very much the experience that I had prior to, went back when I was in nonprofit ed, and where I had studied education. I had worked in education for a while. I was specialized in ed tech. I had some ideas about things that I really knew would work, and fought this uphill battle for years about trying to help people use them really well. And I got to that point. Luckily, I didn't just get jaded about it, but I definitely felt it at times. But what I ended up doing was drilling down and saying, okay, so here's this tribe, essentially, like you said, of like-minded people that I can really work with, and I can make a difference here, and I can use them as exemplars for the rest of the school and maybe make a difference through them for others. And then there's going to be this other tribe of people at the far end of that spectrum that I just know are not interested in ever talking to me about anything but, hello, how was your weekend?
Yes.
And that was actually one of the reasons that I wanted to leave for nonprofit ed and go to for-profit, and where it's not the military, but you do have more control over what the teachers are doing and ability to create cohesion in that. So very much resonated for me what you just said.
Is this true outside of getting a community to adopt some sort of new curriculum scheme, or does this even happen when you're doing maybe rounds of point specific feedback, right, with a teacher, maybe a more intensive professional development setting? Did those kinds of programs scale? I think of all the manager training that I've taken, it feels like it helped.
So here's another example that tried to scale and it didn't work out in real life. So you guys will recall Bill Gates at one point, maybe around 2005 or so, said, hey, I'm going to put a few $100 million into improving teachers. Measuring teachers was a big part of the sort of phase one of this, the Measuring Effective Teacher Project. And they started, one of the things they did was they looked at, hey, we see these outlier charter schools where it really does have this good culture of teacher accountability and evaluation. It all makes sense to us. They look at the test score gains, but not exclusively. They do observations, but not exclusively. They ask the kids who are the good teachers and why, but not, they have a balanced approach, and it stands up to a visit. It makes sense. And then on top of that, these charters seem to have unusually large gains for kids. And then we talk to the teachers. Most of them say, this is a pretty good evaluation system. I feel like I'm getting better. So here's like an exemplar, right? And that idea, the idea that teachers should not be 99% rated satisfactory, which was the status quo in 2005 when Gates started this work, that there should be a distribution of teachers and some should genuinely be, judged as great and others should get meaningful feedback on how to improve and a few should be called out for being really, really bad at what they do. It should be a bell curve. And so, as you guys recall, there were all these efforts and there was this federal race to the top, which was linked to the idea of each state needs to have an accountability system, blah, blah, blah. The whole idea was, let's spread the practice of just reasonable, good, professional review of teachers instead of the everybody is fine status quo. It all made it through legislatures. It all made it through districts. But by the time, in the end, all of this infrastructure was built, it was toothless. Everybody who both supported and opposed this all agreed it ended up as a waste of time. And I think that to me, what happens often, even as people are in the middle of trying to scale practices, you can tell fairly easily that the people on the ground just have very low buy-in. They're resisting the underlying premise. So they're not debating the details of what's the right way to evaluate a teacher? Should we lean more on what the kids think about it or what the observer thinks or the test score gains? They're not asking questions like that. They're just going through the motions in a way. If you have a drink with them, they'll reveal, we're just fake doing this. And so it will be dead. If there were a stock market or a futures market about any particular education initiative, and you could short sell, there'd be a bunch of insiders who've been through this process a million times who would make a lot of money by saying, Gates is going to spend $1 billion to try to achieve this. I'm going to spend $1 million and try to leverage it as much as I can to say, at some point, he'll absolutely declare defeat, admit it, move on to some other adventure philanthropically, and I'll make whatever the arbitrage is on that $1 million. There would be a lot of short selling of this stuff. That's an important point to me because it's not a surprise to certain people in the sector when the stuff doesn't scale. They kind of can feel out the situation and say right away, this isn't going to work. And the reason I know it is the people that you're trying to convince tell us that they are not convinced. And you don't have enough power to force feed it down their throat.
Well, and part of it is just the difficulty of any sort of systemic change. That change is really hard. Change management's really hard. Companies don't often do it well. And a lot of times the PD for teachers is, here's this new thing, you got to learn this now. And then also you've got to continue doing the rest of your job that is already more than a full-time job. So here's more change on top of that you got to learn, and it's really hard. So what I'm taking from this is, don't bother to try to change. Change won't work. Everything stays the same, and the tribes just go in their own merry way, right? There's no bright light at the end of the tunnel here.
All right.
Or is there actually a way to manage?
I'll tell you the things that I see that do work, but they're at the tails. So It's definitely at most a half loaf. If the full loaf is, we do research, we figure out what works for kids, and then we spread it around and boom, it all happens. So I think the two things are embracing individual teacher choice, just admitting that your coercion and management powers are low. And Brian, that's obviously what you were doing with the micro schools. It's just sort of on steroids. It's like, if the teacher is an individual actor with most of the power and you weren't wasting huge amounts of effort to mildly coerce them in an inefficient way, you could hand them a lot of the resources to actually be better at the game they are trying to play and win. You could lean into that, and instead of
lean into their individuality.
So, for example, if you ran a school system, instead of spending $10,000 a year to force feed PD that they'll ignore, and force feed curriculum that they're going to try to marginalize and force feed ed tech and all these other things, you would just say, look, here's the 10 grand. And also, here's like a market that exists that tries to help you find what kind of teacher you are and what are the tools that would support you with some of the beliefs that you have. So that would be one path, I think, is embracing that reality.
The other, which jump in with the with a question on that, but to just challenge that for a second, because what you're, or not challenge, to just examine it. What you're saying is embrace, basically allow a good teacher to flourish, right? So we trust the teacher to be good, to do good things, to make good choices, and therefore we're investing in this person to go their own way potentially and make choices that are going to make them better teachers based on the idea that they are already a good teacher. Some teachers are not good teachers. And so saying to someone, well, you can just go your own way when the person has bad instincts to begin with, or is, relying on certain teaching methods. And I'm trying not to share too much detail, but right now in my fourth graders class, there is a major problem with the teaching methods of her teacher that are very much negativity based, punishment based, and would be a problem if the person were to lean in on that and say, I want to develop my ability to punish my students. So what I'm taking from this is that a lot of this involves trust in the teacher, making sure that you hire the right people, and then making sure that you encourage them to keep going on that path. Is that an accurate read?
Here's how I would challenge what you're saying, although I agree with the frame. Like, there's a bell curve tail, and some people are very problematic at the low end of the tail.
Right.
And if we could all wave a magic wand, we would hold them accountable, ultimately removing them if they persisted in the kind of negative behavior that your fourth graders is experiencing. I'm sorry for that. But the way I would put it is, let's imagine 3 teachers for the sake of our discussion. One is a 7 out of 10, one's a 5 out of 10, and one's a 3 out of 10.
Okay.
I think that if your point was the good teacher, the 7 out of 10, if freed up from waste of time type professional development and actually allowed to do their own thing, find their own tribe, they might become an 8 or an 8.5. Mm-hmm. I further speculate that the 5 out of 10, the median teacher, who is provably not improving, like they are locked to be a 5 out of 10 as far as the eye can see, some of those would improve in a, like if they were at least able to try to get better at the way they want to get better, and some would not. But you would, on average, if you had 100 5 out of 10 teachers, some of those teachers would get better if they had more freedom. Right now, 0 of them are improving in the status quo. I think you're right about the 3 out of 10, and I would sort of offer 2 versions of the bad teacher. I think there are some that are spinning their wheels almost like manically. Like, we all have experienced teachers like that, and sometimes probably we ourselves have been like that, where they're genuinely trying. If you walk into their classroom, it's not going well, but boy, do they have a lot of anxiety about it. They're trying to fix it. They just don't know how. They don't know where to start. There's like a tipping point of negative culture in their class. But some of those people are actually rescuable. However, there's some teachers that are anchored in their negative behaviors and also resistant to change and resistant to critique.
Right.
When you say trust, I'm not saying the half loaf I'm offering is right now. I think those 3 teachers, the 3, the 5, and the 7, will all stay the same as far as the eye can see. If you give them autonomy, some may improve. Mm-hmm. The others aren't going to get worse. That's the thing. I don't think in the current thing, your 4th grader is, unfortunately, in most schools, the principal's not going to come in and do what he or she should and say, this is absolutely intolerable. And if you continue, you're out, and you need to improve in the following structured way. And I'm going to be in your class in an hour and expecting to see something different. And then again tomorrow at 8 and see something different. That was actually
the email that I sent to the principal this morning. So I hope
that's what you said needs to happen.
This is what I said needs to happen. So yeah, I'm on the same page, but I agree that a lot of times the bad behavior just stays. Yeah.
Yeah. And, let's offer just a different, for your listeners, something different, which is other systems sometimes do change despite resistance. I mean, Moneyball, Michael Lewis telling the Moneyball story was like a classic example of that, right? It's sort of like all the old timers, all the veteran people hated what statistics was bringing, the idea that you need to take walks and the idea that their talent evaluation was wrong, all of these things. But because it was a results-driven and highly accountable, there's an owner who has some unilateral power to decide who's the general manager, and ultimately, right, like the resisting coaches and scouts get fired, and ultimately the players are rewarded who are genuinely better baseball players when it turns out they generate more wins. So I think there are systems where improvement, I just feel like embracing what teaching in our culture really is, which is a high amount of teacher autonomy, is at least a realistic starting point of real life. You can imagine a different world where that's not true, but that's not the sort of professional system of American teaching. There is a lot of teacher autonomy, and I think they're more held back on average by the stuff imposed on them than they are lifted up.
Yeah.
Have you heard of any ideas that lean into the ability to both embrace and realize that teachers are going to do whatever not roughly whatever they're going to do, they have autonomy, while also balancing, look, the only way we get better is we run scientific studies of some variety. Otherwise, it's just, how are we progressing the industry, right? Or progressing the practice.
I think there's a lot of small potatoes efforts in here, but their motivation, unfortunately, is more to like politically kiss teacher butt. And therefore, what they look like is like, hey, here's a few $100, spend it however you want. And like the teacher's like, all right, well, I'm already putting $1,200 a year into my classroom and supplies, but thanks for the $300. Or why don't you pick your own professional development among these 5 district approved providers? But all 5 are stupid and suck. So it's like, all right, what's the least painful one, or the easiest one, or the one I can sleep through the easiest? Like, it's not a genuine, hey, let's unlock the huge amounts of money. We're spending 10 grand a year, 20 grand a year on your room of 20 kids, right? Because like, think about in Boston, they're spending $30,000 or so per kid per year, right? So each classroom of 20 kids is a $600,000 unit. The teacher's getting 100 grand of that with, in Boston, and with whatever the benefits is getting 150 grand of that, with retirement, maybe 170 of that. And like the building needs to be paid for and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of money in a $600,000 classroom that's just sort of disappearing that could be unlocked. But school systems are very reluctant for obvious reasons, because the illusion that, hey, we know what we're doing and we're telling our teachers to do the following things and they're doing it, it's almost an essential thing of any leader. Like, it would be a weird parent night where the principal had the conversation we're having on this podcast, right? The principal's like, look, in real life, in your actual schools, I have very little control over what goes on. So what we've done is we're embracing the individuality of the teacher. So since that would be a weird conversation, it probably wouldn't go well. It's not part of the culture. And so they instead say,
do whatever they want.
They say they have a plan for everything. It's like, it's skin deep, but they nominally have a plan for everything. Oh, here's what we're going to do about, the math standards. Here's what we're going to do about school safety. Here's what we're going to do about bullying. And all the kids are like, you ask your kids, your 4th grader as your, Sean, as your like, gauge of what's really happening. And they're like, none of that is really happening in real life. But I will say the other hopeful thing, I do want to call out, there are some systems that are much more like aligned. So Success Academies in New York City, those 49 charter schools, which have very high achievement, it's like a real vision, a very professional vision, and they're very selective both on the front end for teachers. Like, we're not playing around, and obviously, Brian, you know this world. We are something unusual. You don't have to join us if you don't want to. Definitely don't come here just for a job. You can go to any regular school for that. Come here if you want to be part of our sort of elite core. And then on the flip side of it, they're holding people accountable to actually do their systems, to teach in their way. And by the way, if they got an email from a parent like you, Sean, that says, this is pretty intolerable, what my fourth grader is, describing, like that gets taken very seriously, I think, in a context like that. Or just as another alternative, at Bridge, our group of schools in the developing world, mostly in Africa, we would say to people, hey, listen, this is not a conventional Kenyan school or Nigerian school. It's unusual. We have a very specific approach to curriculum and teaching style, and only join us if that's what you want. And we're going to screen pretty aggressively for that. So I think there are systems that are able to get teachers rowing in the same direction, but it doesn't work well if you have sort of a typical school district that is really hiring people with a whole bunch of different beliefs about what teaching and learning should be. It's hard to get a group that's that varied to then a few years in say, oh, we all agree to teach in the following way.
Right, the different tribes thing. Yeah, and my feeling, again, back when I was at Riverdale, was that it would have been a lot easier to start, and this is not saying it's easy to start a new school, but it would have been a lot easier to start a new school with a shared mission and vision than it would have been to really change everything about how the school was happening and how things were happening there. And so what I'm hearing here is partly that, you haven't explicitly said this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Is it that scale is more possible with that shared vision and direction, and that the process, the shared process, would scale more successfully if you started from the same place? So I'm thinking of my other daughter is actually attending Sora schools, which was one of the people that the co-founders we interviewed on this podcast, and they have started from a very specific direction in schooling. It's very student interest based and very activity based and project driven and all of that stuff. And so they have sort of, I think, a similar approach when they're hiring a teacher that Success Academy would have, which is, this is the thing that we've built. This is where we're trying to go. Here's the kind of teacher we're looking for. Is that you? And if not, cool. There's lots of other schools. Go find one. So at least I hope that's how they're hiring, because otherwise it's going to become a mess as they continue to grow. So is what you're saying that if you can have that shared vision and shared purpose from the beginning, that scale becomes a lot more possible? Because that seems like a reasonable thing to me. Or does it just fall apart again when you get big enough because of the intricacies of all the different personalities and whatnot?
Yeah, I think you've described it well. So I would say then over time, it's a race, right? You're trying to build a culture in the organization that's very hard to unwind over time, versus the fact that as it ages, there's going to be, regression to the mean as people pull on whatever's special, right? So Amazon's culture under Jeff Bezos, when in the early days, right, and he's like in the customer service room and like he takes the customer phone call and they have a complaint, and then he goes, ape on some like division head who isn't perfectly handling that complaint, right? It was like obsessive. Over time, some of those cultures erode, right? The founder leaves, the crazy person leaves, the more seasoned, like polished person takes over, and there's a change in the institution. But you hope certain things are so wound into the culture or certain metrics that it's the countervailing force that keeps the place being special. I will add just one other quick thing, which I think, since we're all designers of different types of interventions and technologies and ways to do things better that are, ultimately trying to help kids, it goes to the ways we learn title, like, how do we learn better? And how do you get teachers to do better? I will say, I think I enjoy causing a certain amount of discomfort or pain, not in a weird way, but on the people that are my colleagues that are charged with building like a new thing, let's say a new math curriculum, I'll just use as an example. So the pain I like to cause them is first of all, I'm looking for someone who thinks of themselves as an engineer and therefore in service of the teacher and not an artist. The artist of a curriculum designer, which I think is most of them, they think, what would I like to do if I was in a room of 20 kids? What would I execute beautifully? And the experience that I give to people instead is, I'm going to separately get somebody to videotape real life regular teachers using whatever your inventions are, constantly feeding back to you what is often negative feedback from real life median teachers, if you will. So the process of normally creating ed tech products, and as we know, a lot, like this is true of not just ed tech and curriculum, it's true of a lot of products in the world. There's product creators that create something delightful in their head. And then there's the question of like, how does the user handle this in real life? And a lot of times those things don't go as well as what the designer originally thought would be happening. And so that experience, the being force-fed, here's how teachers are experiencing your training and downrating it. Here's how teachers are experiencing your ed tech product and downrating, or kids. That is a virtuous cycle that allows them to build something much more robust. But I don't think that many kids or teachers are on the receiving end of innovations that were designed that way. Usually, It's like we built something and maybe we did a little beta test and then we're shipping it. And then there's all kinds of downstream carnage, and the original creators are like, not my problem. They're all misusing it. And my thought would be, no, that is your problem. Like, that needs to be part of your process.
A question I have on the prior thing you said. So it sounded like you said that the two rays of hope are on each end of the bell curve. On one side, you have giving teachers close to full autonomy. There's probably some guardrails. And then on the other side is getting them to buy into some grand vision up front. Is that sort of the central piece of the argument?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yes. Yep. I think the middle is the low buy-in, fake buy-in thing. Like, there's low centralized buy-in to any one vision, so then everybody has to kind of fake go along with whatever the idea of the day is.
So then does that mean that public schools, where it's very hard, I imagine there exist public school districts that have an incredible leader who sets an incredible vision, but the mean, I imagine, is not that.
Yes.
Does that mean that public schools should not be the place to do any of this research, and it should be kind of proven in success academies of the world, and micro schools, in Sora schools, and in places where where the allowed autonomy is very low? And then it's proven there. I go, okay, cool. We know it's going to work. We know it works. Now let's do it on a public school. And then the difference in the success is just the difference in buy-in or something like that. I don't know.
It's a great question. I mean, if I were king and we had these existing, like 3.5 million public school teachers that are mostly in these situations where what they describe is, not sort of mild reluctance of like, okay, I know there's going to be the principal's going to have a new pet way of doing grading, and there's going to be a new software I'm supposed to use, and a new this and a new that. And that's fine because I'm here for the kids and I'll do my thing. But those people are very different. I would say you're better off with the low accountability, high offer type thing, right? Where you're trying to get people to organize in different types of tribes that they recognize, like, I'm like these other people. I want to teach in the same way as them. And I have a lot more control over the resources that are available, is better than the current way those schools are organized. I would not try to get a highly top-down, like right now in Houston, or is it Houston or Dallas, one of the places the Texas commissioner, I think Houston, has kind of taken over the whole thing. And so we'll get an interesting experiment into a very top-down of a broken system, right? It's not just Sean's fourth grade teacher. It's like a lot of teachers that have not had a lot of success they're on the receiving end of a lot of top-down stuff. We'll see what happens. Like, could this guy Mike McGrath, get to the finish line and really transform the culture there?
The question really is, can you scale vision to that level? The level of a district, right? With, I don't know, 100,000, tens of thousands of employees,
yes,
serving hundreds of thousands of students. Can you actually scale a vision to that level? I bet even Amazon hasn't done that.
Yeah,
right. It's not even scaling, right? It's retrofitting. I mean, the thing that's been in my head is it's sort of like trying to put entropy back together, right? There's been a decay that I don't know the exact situation in I think you said Dallas. I don't know the situation there exactly, but to come from the top down in a broken system and then say, let's all reorganize around this shared vision is nearly impossible.
I've joined the group of people who think the top down, I don't have an objection to it if it actually worked in real life. I think there's some people that are like, hey, I hate when like the big guy or the big, gal imposes their will on a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
I would be okay with that if I felt like it were actually helping kids and getting the kids in much better classrooms and sort of like, Sean, if your kid was experiencing a much more thriving classroom, I'd be like, that's fine. It's reasonable to have a top-down system if it actually works.
Right.
But I'm more skeptical at this point that the way to get there is through power. You just don't have enough power. Therefore, the only way to get there is the way we approach almost all consumer decisions in every other domain, right? Like, think about the way that in our consumer lives, people try to convince us of what we might want.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's a better model. If you don't have the power, don't pretend to have the power. Like, that's what I would like to end. It's like, don't have a fake top-down system. You're better off than saying to the 3.5 million teachers, I don't have the power to tell you what to do. Therefore, I know a lot of you are professionals, and I know some of you have different ways of thinking of doing it. I want to make sure that you're able to, if you want to, try to get better in the following ways. And I'll stipulate a whole bunch of you don't even want to get better. Like, I'd rather have the honest conversation about the state of the workforce and where people really are than sort of live this kind of never-ending thing that, New Teacher Project called the mirage, the never-ending like professional development. Then we measure it, we find out teacher behavior did not change.
Mm-hmm. You basically gave Schoolhouse's old pitch, right? That's what I would actually say to teachers is, we want to figure out what you want to do and back that. It seems like at the center, like the through line between the two ends of these bell curves is that it's actually just reducing conflict between like the administration and the business side and the teachers themselves. Like, when I've seen the top-down thing happen, it's almost always just results in sort of conflict or like hidden curriculum and secret, WhatsApp groups where like all the teachers who are doing it the other way are hanging out. And that was one of the most surprising things to me about the Schoolhouse experience is that when we took the approach of, you're an autonomous agent and we're here to support you and to make sure that you have everything you need, all the conflict went away. And I would imagine, and actually what I've seen inside of some of these more vision, mission-driven schools is that the conflict's not there because everybody's bought in up front.
Yes.
Isn't the argument that everyone's bought it up front when it's small?
That's a good one.
I think, though, it depends on
the thing I struggle to separate out is...
But doesn't it depend on...
Like, how much of that is just, you were... I mean, I don't know how big Schoolhouse was at its biggest, but you were, schools, whatever, a few hundred teachers, 50 schools, 50 teachers, then great. That obviously is amazing. But there is another world where is it even possible to scale that mission and vision to 3.5 million public schools teachers, right?
So, Joe, I will give you, so Bridge, it would now called New Globe, in Africa has 25,000 teachers and 1.4 million kids. And so your point about the buy-in thing, And a number of these people are operating in, traditional Nigerian or Rwandan, public schools. So there's a limit in this case on the buy-in. But
Right.
the focus is a very specific lever of a particular type of curriculum. And where the leverage is that the curriculum has been unusually tested and iterated with real life teachers. Because the other thing we haven't talked about is if you're able to create something that the average person thinks is pretty good, it's another way to bypass conflict. So if a typical teacher in Rwanda is gets to her 4th grade math lesson and she's like, I know what I used to do, and now they've given me this thing, and I can use my tablet to teach this way, and it seems to go better from her point of view, you can kind of get buy-in on the back end by just having a delightful experience or product, right? That's another way. If you actually make somebody's life go better, that's the way most consumer products get traction. It's a good experience. So in those cases, you don't have the power maybe to get them to do it. It would be easy as a typical Nigerian public school teacher to try to avoid doing what, New Globe wants you to do. But 7 out of 10 teachers are like, this is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's better than what I did before. It doesn't ask me to work a lot of extra hours or do anything weird. And it culturally seems appropriate. And at the end of the day, its main thing is I say sentences like, all right, kids, instead of me lecturing like I normally do for 45 straight minutes, which is the way a lot of the teaching there happens, they say, instead of that, I'm going to talk for 3 minutes, and then you and the other 2 kids at your table are going to work on the following thing for 10 minutes while I sort of circulate and walk around. That piece has to go well for them to change their behavior. And that's another way to win hearts and minds, right? Actually deliver something that's good.
Yeah, I mean, there's I do love the idea, a little bit of what you said, is that you can test some of these things in high autonomy, low autonomy, high control situations, and then bring some of those results to the areas where you're really scaled, and you have the opportunity to be more convincing and be an exciting thing that, these people want. Most of the teachers want to be great. I mean, I think a lot of this we're getting into is teacher hiring really matters.
Yes.
It's just so frustrating.
Yes.
It's just so frustrating. It's just the number one thing that moves the needle, I've always found.
But the other thing you can think about as a thought experiment is if you can just have a school, if you will, or a group of all 5 out of 10 teachers, but you redistribute them. So you have 3 schools, and each one has 30 teachers, and they're all exactly average, but they all disagree about how to basically what the school experience should be like. And then you can reorganize those exactly equal in quality teachers, but they're now with their type of person, with their type of leader, so they can row in the same direction. A question back to you guys is, does that potentially create a better experience for the students? Because what used to be average teachers are now average teachers that are aligned, and so they're able to actually improve and do things. Like they can get more out of their hourly, meeting every week, their team meeting, because they're not debating the general proposition of what should even a good classroom look like, where Sean's 4th grade teacher thinks it should look like a classroom where the teacher's yelling at the kids. That, if you're debating that, obviously you're not going to make any progress. But if you're debating something more subtle, and Joe can say, I had success with this kid in math that I've never had success in before, and the other 3 of us are listening carefully because we share a lot of intellectual DNA, improvement happens in systems like that. So that's an inherent problem. It's not just selecting good people, but it's allowing regular people to find more of an aligned tribe. And so that cuts against the basic idea we think of public schools, where roughly they should all be sort of the same.
Yeah. I've got this rolling around in my head that it's not just thinking about teacher hiring, because I'm with you that with what was just said, that teacher hiring is so critical. It's so important, and it's having good teachers is maybe the best indicator of how well you're going to be able to change or grow or improve or all that. It's not just hiring, in my mind, it's not just hiring good teachers, it's hiring teachers who are interested in improving, teachers who are interested in change. And so to me, the tribe that I would want at a school is less about specific pedagogical practice and more about shared interest in improvement. And I'm going back to when I was at Riverdale Country School and I was running the academic technology program. I built this professional development program for teachers, and this was sort of what I referenced about catering to the people who were interested in working with me. And so I built this program that was wide open, and I think it was very much actually what you're describing as I'm thinking about this, because it was a foundational course in best practices in education, educational theory, and applied educational science in the classroom. And it was the hook was that it was called the Pedagogy and Technology Workshop. And I'm revealing my secrets here. I don't know if anybody who was in it was listening to me, but the actual point of this was not the technology, it was the good teaching. And so I got people in the door saying, hey, you're going to learn how to use the tech in your classroom. But really it was about, let's learn how to do backward design, and let's learn how to think about Bloom's taxonomy and higher order thinking, and then back these things up with great application of technology. And so we had people come in from wide-ranging approaches to education. There were the futurists, the people who were like, yeah, I'll try anything new. That's cool. And then we had some people who were very traditional in their approach, but all of them were interested in improvement and change. And it was a very, very successful program for a subset of the population at the school, but it was growing every year. And it seems to me like that's maybe the key, is that it's not that you want all of the people rowing in the same pedagogical direction so much as you want people rowing in the same intellectual direction. We want to improve. We want to get better at our jobs. We want to create a better experience for our students, no matter what that means to me as the specific teacher in that classroom. And then given that, we're all trying to improve and the cross-pollination is happening.
Yes, right. Are there early adopters that then share it with others?
Right.
And are they intellectually, do they have some version of like a growth mindset about we're actually trying to improve? Right. And to some degree, since some people honestly are not at that moment in their careers trying to improve, you need some ability to separate them, or at least not that allow them to pollute the group of people that are genuinely trying to improve, right? Like, like the mock, jokey version of PD is always, like as shown on TV and stuff like that. If you're trying to like show real life through comedy, you basically show professional development where there's always some bomb throwers in there that are just trying to blow up the basic proposition.
Right. And
it blocks the kind of progress that you're talking about. I'll give you like a different hopeful example where, so with this company called QMath, we have 3,400 math tutors, okay? And we studied a bunch of videotape and we found a common thing is true of our tutors that's true of all tutors and math teachers, which is the math teachers tend to talk too much for a specific reason. They talk too much because they're like, okay, kid, how do you find the slope of the line? And then the kid's like, yeah, I'm not sure, I'm a little confused. And the teacher says, don't worry, here's how you do it. And then what happens after that is like 3 minutes of the teacher saying, so you see, you put the X over here, you do. And we know like a struggler has already tuned out, like at second number 8, 10, 12, they've already, like the whole 3 minutes is just this like word cloud.
Right.
They can't absorb it. But even as parents or teachers, it's hard for us to stop that because it's such a intuitive way to get the kid. Like it's there in my brain. Yeah. I just want to shove it in your brain. Let me do that.
Yep.
And so we looked at that practice and see, so what do we want to do about it? Do we like try to train people? And we're like, nah, because like normal training doesn't seem to change people's behavior about this. So here's what we tried. And there's a Stanford researcher who helped us with this, and she's about to publish on this. So I'll describe what we did, and then you can guess what you think happened. So we said, let's create a Fitbit type thing. Let's just create a talk meter, and it'll pop up in minute number 20 and minute number 40 of the tutorial. And the talk meter will just say, here's the ratio of kid talk and tutor talk.
Oh my God, I love this.
And so I'll start with that. So we started with like a tiny little pilot. What do you guys think happened? And then I'll tell you what happened. And then we did a round 2.
So, I mean, in terms of actual ratio or just...
Yeah, what do you think ratio? What do you think, like, did it go reasonably well? Did teachers like it, hate it? What did kids do in response? Like, what happened?
I think the teachers felt very self-conscious, probably, and I think they were probably talking a lot more than they thought they were. In terms of numbers, I don't know, 50-50? I guess.
Yeah, so here's what happened. So first of all, this group of tutors, they're really fun to work with because the typical one is somebody who majored in like physics or engineering back in college, then worked professionally, let's say for Deloitte or something in India, then had children. And so then they were stay at home and they're doing math tutoring because it's a fun way to professionally engage, right? So they're people who are pretty open to professional feedback. So one nice thing about this work for our whole team, we're always saying to each other, oh my God, these tutors are so open to feedback. Like that's one part of it. So then we found that they were willing to talk less. So we made some progress. If the baseline case was, let's say, they talked 60% of the time, they would go down to about 52, 51%. But the way they did that is probably the way I should do this in my marriage. They simply talked less. They said fewer words. And as a result, the ratio of kid stuff went up, and the kid had more time to think about stuff, but it wasn't quite what we wanted. So we tried a different version. The different version was we took the exact same talk meter, but now we also put it on the kids' screen. And we had like a little session for the kids, a little lesson where he said, hey kid, we're doing this thing. We're putting up a talk meter and we'd love it to be 50-50 where you talk as much as the tutor. And here's why we want to hear your voice. Here's why your tutor wants to hear where you're confused. So we showed the kids actual models of other kids saying like, I don't really know what you want me to do with slope of line, but I remember it's like, has to do with the line. Is it flat or is it diagonal?
So you're almost gamifying it.
We're gamifying it a little bit. And so in that thing, which this, sort of Journal of Education research Stanford will put out, will say, it's like, that also got us to a 50-50 ratio, but in a different path, where now the kids are talking more in a productive way.
Yeah.
And so from her measures, she has all these like qualitative measures of engagement and math and all this other stuff. She's like, oh my God, you're really like moving the needle here. And I think that type of experimentation is an example of how you can start to change practice if you have some kind of feedback loop. That's one of the challenges of teaching is often it's pretty lonely. You do your performance and then how do you know how you did? So this one's at least a little tool, right?
Yeah, and often how you did is based on how you feel, and often how you feel is based on how much you were talking. So, man, that class felt great. I was so engaged and active, and it was really cool, and the kids must have loved it, and the kids have been sitting there just staring at you the whole time.
So true.
Yeah. I love putting that emphasis on not just, that's great. Not just can the teacher talk less, but can the student work to talk more, and gamifying that aspect of it. And they're not just going to sit there going, blah, 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 blah. They're actually going to try to say something meaningful, even if they don't know what the meaningful thing is, but then they're actually exercising their brain and working with the concepts. That's brilliant.
So what's interesting is basically you created like a nudge, if you've ever read that book.
Yes.
Yeah. Where there's essentially a feedback loop of data in real time, I guess, right?
Yes. Although we experimented with, does it matter if it's real time or you email them later and tell them what their score was?
Does it?
Real time helps.
Yeah,
but not constant. Like we found the best model is 20-minute, 40-minute end of lesson.
Got it.
then the meter goes away. Like it's not always on
Interesting.
your screen.
Interesting.
You know, there's something really interesting about that too, because it still enables autonomy, right? It still enables me, me as the coach to figure out how am I going to talk less, right? You're not coming in and telling me, hey, we want you to talk less, we want you to do this, and this is like professional training on doing that. You're basically saying we want you to talk less. I mean, you give the student a little bit of information, but you're basically saying like, hey, we want you to talk less, and here's a meter.
I think the intervention, we tested different versions of it. So when we just give them the meter, the typical teacher was saying to us very directly, this is when we pilot it with like 5-10 teachers. They're all like, how do I do better? So,
Well, that's good though.
which is great. So then they were genuinely interested. So then we're like, all right, we'll develop. So the intervention technically ended up being an hour-long PD session
Okay.
that teachers clearly wanted. It was sort of like, you're going to have this talk meter, and this is why that matters. This is why how much you talk and the kid talks matters. It's going to go to like how much they learn, all these other things. And then we were able to cover a lot of the specific common use cases. What do I do with the introverted kid who doesn't want to talk?
Yep.
What do I do when I'm asking the kid what they think, but they can't articulate it? What do I do when the only way forward is going to be, I got to tell them how to do this math procedure. Like if I'm hiding it, it's not helping anybody. And we were able to get enough concrete examples of what they described as the common situations that they're like, okay, that was a good training. And the training was in service of this technology change that was happening. So it wasn't quite, they still had a lot of autonomy, but it was sort of like there's a technical component to this that's more than just go do whatever you want.
Gotcha. I'm actually, while we're on the topic of tutoring, I'm actually curious about the match. I mean, if we can move over to that.
Yeah.
The match tutoring program that you built, where you had a built-in corpus of highly educated tutors who live on the school premises and provide the students intense academic support throughout the day. So it wasn't an add-on. They weren't teacher helpers. They were built into the school day, right?
Yes.
Can you talk about just like the structure and the design of that? Like if you were explaining it to me and I was going to go put it at another school, and then I would love to hear where the scale pieces broke down, or like where you think they broke down as they went up. I mean, I know that's where you had the economists come in. But
Yes.
I'd love to hear about the structure of that program, because it does seem like it did work for the small scale at Match.
It worked great in the original. So yeah, here was the pitch. If you guys were like, in your senior year of college, we would go to you and say, hey, listen, we have 200 kids in our little high school, and they would do so much better if they could each get 2 hours a day of tutoring from someone just like you. And we could try to deploy you as a rookie, like Teach for America style teacher with 20 kids at once, but you're probably going to suck at that. But we can deploy you with 2 kids at a time, and you're actually going to be pretty good because it massively simplifies. It's not easy, but it really simplifies your stuff. You'll build these good relationships with kids. You'll give a year to us of service. We're going to pay you basically in macaroni and cheese, and you'll live in a triple on our 3rd floor, just like kind of like your freshman year of college. So you're still living that cheapo life and, finding the cheapest alcohol you can, etc. So we made that pitch, and at that time, there were a lot of people doing Teach for America, but there weren't a lot of competing tutor cores like this. So we'd have a ton of people who applied, and we were able to pick some really good people to be our tutors that have gone on to do all kinds of great things. And so they'd come to us for a year, and that's what they would do all day. Like, from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., here's your 2 ninth graders. From 10 a.m. to noon, here's your 2 10th graders, and so forth. And so achievement there was super high. And a guy who's now at Brown University did sort of the first study and was like, wow, these are kind of eye-popping results. And a guy who I've since become friends with, who was a different Harvard economist named Roland Fryer, said, hey, Mike, the superintendent of the Houston public school system, this guy named Terry Greer, wants me to come in and take 9 of his worst schools and try to fix them. And as part of that, can I get you and your team of tutors? Can you get 250 full-time tutors to come down into Houston and do exactly what you're doing at Match? You're not going to live in the dorm, but it's the same idea. they're going to be full-time tutors every day, all day. So we do that, and it goes pretty well in a different context. But you can just imagine that was like a fight all along the way where like every other day I'd have to call up the superintendent or Roland and say, I need you to shoot the heavy artillery at your HR associate named Joe Smith, who's like, has all kinds of weird, jargony things that are obstacles to our hiring. So constantly calling in heavy artillery to like allow us to get to the kids and give them good tutoring. But again, it was like it went well. And since this is an economist doing it, it was like these results are not just eye-popping, but they're credible, like very empirically sound. So the next layer was my colleague, Alan, and one of our former match students named Antonio decided to take this at a larger scale. So they brought it to Chicago and some other cities as its own nonprofit, now called Saga Education. And there the evidence continued to build. So it was like these University of Chicago economists saying, oh my God, this is like the best intervention since sliced bread. Look at the gains. And so that gets us through like 2018, 19 or so, pre-COVID, where tutoring is having a moment and all these researchers are like, high dosage tutoring the way Match does it is really great for kids. Then a second part of the story happened, which is less appealing, but that's how we kind of climbed up the mountain.
Got it. And then how did they interact? Were they just reactive to the students, or were they sort of built into the curriculum itself where like they came in knowing the things that they wanted to review with the students? Like how did the program actually work like with the student and the tutor?
Yeah, Brian, the most typical thing we would say to you is like, look, for about half the lesson or half your total time with a kid, you're going to be working systematically through curriculum. So it'll be like, okay, here's today's work, problem 1, let's go. And then half the time we'll protect for you to do the rear guard action where you can say, listen,
gotcha.
You don't really even know your times tables. Don't worry, we're going to knock that out, but like you need that. But Sean, you're also in our little tutorial because it's 2-on-1 tutoring. You do know your times tables. I don't have to work with you on that. But there's some other stuff. You don't really seem to understand negative numbers. I'm going to help you with that. So there was tutor autonomy for part of the lesson to fix old stuff, and then a move ahead type curriculum. And that seemed to be a good balance. Different over the years, that ratio got sometimes played with in different ways, but that was the rough idea.
Gotcha. And then where did it continued to grow? You rode the rocket ship up of people coming back and saying great things. So then where did it start to capsize and how did the plane land? Or like, where is this at now actually?
So this is just Mike's opinion. So, and I think other people would tell.
I think that's the whole podcast.
Yeah, I guess it is. But I feel a little sensitive. So it's sort of like, this is somebody else's organization. It's not mine, Saga Education, that my friend Alan runs. And I think his take would be probably somewhat different on it. Although, certainly there's a lot of stuff we would agree on. But here's what happened. So at the same moment that all kinds of people are getting worried about COVID learning loss, high dosage tutoring is having its peak moment in terms of research. So these two different streams hit together in a way that seems like, oh my God, why don't we put together chocolate and peanut butter? Like, high dosage tutoring is good for kids. The research supports it. Oh my God, we have all these kids that are behind. Like, and so what happened was the palooza of tutoring supply getting stood up all over the place. New tutoring companies, new tutoring nonprofits. Hey, we do some version of tutoring. And this demand side coming up, all at, to kind of say we need tutoring, but the quality of what they were getting was vastly different than the sort of, careful farm-to-table curated type of tutoring that Match and then Saga had been doing. So for the last couple years, there's been explosions of kids, at least on the receiving end of something called tutoring, but that turned out to be a mix of good faith but sort of poorly executed traditional tutoring, where like if the three of us walked around in those schools, we'd be like, there's a lot of kids not really paying any attention to their tutor. That was like the good case. The bad case was just really some charlatan type companies. Like nobody was really even getting the tutoring. So this company called Paper, for example, has been in the news a lot. Sort of rose this huge market cap, raised a ton of money, and their basic service was saying to a district, we'll provide tutoring to all your kids, and all they need to do is like sort of call the hotline or go online and they'll get help. But they knew in creating this service that almost no kids would ever do that. So finally, all these newspaper reports are coming out, like a school district paid $500,000 for a contract with this tutoring company, and 4 kids ever called the hotline. You know, like that type of over a year, right? So it's sort of like, so now they're cratering, but it's also, you can imagine all these people that don't follow the story very closely are like, yeah, tutoring seems like a dumb use of resources because of the way it's rolled out at scale.
Did that
Do
affect,
you have?
did that affect Match?
Actually,
Sorry,
Go
did
ahead,
that affect Match, given the public perception that you're describing? Did that affect the way that Match was able to continue to do its business?
So, I think you're talking about Saga now, which is the Match spinoff.
Saga.
Yeah.
Saga.
So it has affected them. So they have been trying to fight the good fight, Sean. And so they basically, they're out there, they're on panels, they're with state, commissioners of education, and they're basically imploring people like, do it right. Like this only helps kids if you attend to this, and this. And if you kind of half-ass it, it doesn't really help anybody and you'll get frustrated. But you can imagine that their message is the classic message of implement with fidelity with really capable leaders. And like these school district leaders are like, but what if I don't have a bench of those people? I'm either like, I have to do something. And so what do you want me to do? Like, I'm just going to find somebody who says they do tutoring and try to do it as best I can.
So I'm surprised we made it this far in the podcast without anybody saying this, but is AI the solution for this? Are the AI tutors the solution?
So
I'm really curious. Honestly, I'm exceedingly curious to hear your opinion on
what do you think I'm going to say? Predict it first.
I think you're probably going to say that it can be used to mimic portions of it, but there's a whole series of things that the humans do that the AI hasn't yet learned to replicate. Probably like figuring out where the student is at, like currently in their knowledge, is a hard thing for an LLM to do. That's my opinion. I guess I just put it in your mouth.
I'm actually pretty impressed, and I've been following pretty closely. Like even what my buddy was reminding me, like my priors on this have changed even in the last 6 months. I follow what GPT-4, Conmigo, and Claude, which is like Anthropic's, LLM, like how they interact with kids when they try to do math tutoring. It's pretty good. So I think where we're moving towards is the explanation and help a kid get unconfused part of AI already is quite good. The general problem of education that we all understand, which is just like most kids don't want to learn how to knit, and most kids don't want to learn about, ancient Greek civilization. Most kids don't particularly want to learn about X, Y, and Z that we do in schools. There's a big motivation challenge. And so we think of good teachers. We think a lot of times they're able to get kids to reluctantly sometimes engage with content that on their own the kid doesn't particularly want to do. I don't think yet AI has a particular advantage there, which is fine. I do think that like if any of us were helping our own children with math right now, and the choice would be Khan Academy regular or a math workbook or GPT-4, I would say, let's just use GPT-4. It's going to go better.
Gotcha.
But
Sean,
you hit the ceiling around motivation. I think that's the thing that we all know with ed tech, which is there's been so much over-promising. And sometimes the limit is the quality of instruction of the ed tech device, but sometimes it's like the kid doesn't want to do it, and if it's a little better, they still don't want to do it. My daughter doesn't particularly want to learn about right triangles tonight. Like, even if it would teach it really well, there's other stuff she'd rather do.
Yeah, not just being a motivating teacher, but the motivation on the side of the kid. We talked with, we had a guest on here who we were talking to about just human connection and the importance of human connection in creating or activating the neurotransmitters that make it possible for people to connect and create that sort of lead to motivation and learning. And it feels like that feels like one of the things that we're kind of missing as we move towards AI, that you can create a system that's going to mimic a human teacher. I can imagine someone setting up a system or using GPT-4 or whatever to create a prompt that says, okay, so act like an expert teacher, and you're a master teacher, and you're going to do everything in the world that's going to make kids really interested and use these pedagogical techniques and all that stuff, right? It's still a machine. You're still interacting through a screen with something that is a machine. There's some point where having a human, just that fact, is motivational. But I feel like in terms of what the machines are going to be able to do intellectually, I don't know. I'd be surprised if we're not there already, except for maybe the fact that the LLMs are prediction models and not calculators, and therefore math can be a really difficult thing for GPT-4 to handle when it's not actually calculating, but it's predicting a math answer, and so it can teach the theory but not the actual calculation. Aside from that part, though, it feels like teaching theory, I don't know. I'd be surprised if a machine couldn't be a good tutor. It feels like it's the human interaction element, that sort of intangible being with a person, ideally in the same room. That thing is what the machine can't do.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I'm studying this, and so if you say, hey, like, I'm supposed to find the volume of this sphere and I'm stuck, and you have to choose between an average math tutor and the existing GPT-4,
right?
I'm telling you, GPT-4 is going to do a better job of getting the kid unstuck right now.
Right.
Like, let alone and it just added voice like a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
There's like choppiness and all these different things, as you guys know, but like, we're on our way where like you're likely to get a very good back and forth dialogue. As long as you're trying to engage with it, it's going to help you as a tool.
Yeah.
But the experience, like you said, at the end of the day, of wanting the social experience of being around other kids, wanting the human teacher to kind of be orchestrating that interaction, I don't think that's going away. So I don't predict we're going to end up with these schools where it's like, yeah, show up, put on your computer and just
machine. Yeah.
do this. I don't think that's what families and kids are going to want.
Yeah.
But increasingly, it'll be part of what the school day is.
Yeah. So we actually might see some forward momentum on the scale from these LLMs, but the last frontier is human motivation. We have to figure out how to get people to want to engage with them.
Yeah, and I get pitched all the time. I'm like, oh, we've got these emotional support robots. We've got these things. And, like, I don't know. I'm just saying, like, I've got, like, 2 teenagers in the house. And you realize it's easy to forget, if you are in the education space and you care a lot about achievement, that schools are not even, as their primary thing, they're not achievement factories. They're social places. Yeah. And you kind of reluctantly come to that if you're like, oh, I'd really love kids to learn more. And so that becomes like but then there's all these other people, like, you friggin' idiot, I've been telling you this for 20 years. It's like, the kids are there to be around the other kids. And the best teachers are the ones that can make that experience a memorable one, a worthwhile one. And it doesn't overlap that well with how much total achievement is generated. There's a relationship, but it's not super tight.
Yeah. Makes sense to me. Sean, what else do you have? Mike, this is amazing, by the way. I
This is-
haven't laughed this much on an episode yet.
I haven't even busted your chops because, like, when I looked at the Ways We Learn thing on Apple Podcasts, it's
Are you
like
going to talk about the bow tie?
the bow tie. Were you
Sean-
like moonlighting as a waiter that night? What's up with the bow tie?
That was from my wedding. Is the only Sean has complete creative control.
I love it. It definitely throws us for a loop. It's like Brian's not really a bow tie type of guy, but there he is with the bow tie.
I was
did
referred
just-
to once as a schlubby James Lipton.
on a podcast episode. No, I actually gave
It's episode
Brian the
1.
option- It was episode 1. I actually gave Brian the option of sending me a different picture for that, and he
No, I loved
opted
it.
out and said, "Don't you ever change that." So
Yeah, I love it.
He's
I
on
find
board.
it hilarious.
I love it.
I think it's great. And also just wait till you see what happens in our video episodes when one of us can't be on camera. I just created
We have an AI version.
an AI assisted version of Joe holding
Oh, right.
up-
So Joe right now in the bottom screen of he's going to be filled in with like a
He-
panda or something.
No, it's going to be Joe, but it's going to be Joe holding an old timey phone and giving a thumbs up with a big smile on his face. And I still need to create one for Brian. So
That's
having
awesome.
fun.
we're using AI to its best over here.
Mike, do you have a half a minute for a unrelated question, or do you have to jump now? Because
Let's see, 6:05. Yeah,
6:05.
I could do another couple minutes.
this is unrelated, and it's
Let me,
probably not for the episode, but
yeah, Brian, let me
could be.
wrap this and then, or do you want to record it?
it could be. We can cut
Oh,
it
okay.
out.
Yeah. So keep going.
I got pulled in on a project, and like I've been thinking about you. Private school trying to reduce its attrition numbers. It's online. How would you be thinking about that? Like, how would you approach that problem? Because there's like 1,000 old wives' tales about why something's happening, but actually, when you talk to the people, but like actually getting to like the ground truths of like what would cause someone to leave. How would you approach that? I'm trying to get better myself, so I'm going to the master here.
So this is work that we did with Match to address our own attrition issues, like a lot of charters. And we had our own, like certainly I and others had our own, if you will, self-interested or our own hypotheses. And then we could ask leading questions in our research that we didn't want to do. So I think we anchored in two ways. One is I got some outside people that I thought were fairly neutral who could listen to all the hypotheses, but their job was and I picked people that I thought were good reporters. Like that was their background. They were journalists that I thought were good, fair, maybe not like journalists today that might be more, some of whom are like very tribal, right? They were just good questioners and curious people. And I said, listen, you got to figure out what's really going on, but you need to be anchored into one specific thing, which is you have to understand where the kid ended up. And that has to be the beginning of your conversation with them. Because if you ask open-ended, why did you leave? It's different than if you said, you used to be at Match Charter School, and now you're at Brighton High School. And let's start by just telling me some of the differences between Match or Old. And so it starts as like anchored in the choice that they made or their parents made of where they ended up, which to me created a lot of, since you're voting with your feet,
Brilliant.
it creates a good anchor. And then you're just asking them to like, in almost the way you would, like, what would you say to another kid? How would you describe your new school? How would you describe your old school? Or a new kid moves to Boston. He's like, I don't know whether to go to Match or Brighton High. How are they different? Should I go with you to Brighton High, or do you regret it at all? Or like what happened or something like that? That was a good anchor that got people talking. Instead of,
Why'd you leave?
without that anchor, it could kind of go off the rails.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was like. I don't know how to even go about approaching this problem, and I've been like listening to you for a while. And I'm like, I bet Mike knows the answer. I'm gonna ask him at the end. Oh, I lost
really
my
smart.
headphone.
Oh, did it pop out? You right?
Yeah, I
You're
have
still
one
hearing?
now. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, the mic still works. I couldn't hear you in my left ear.
That was really interesting to hear that. That makes so much sense. Yeah.
Sean, Mike has
Very cool.
almost all. He has at least the beginning,
Let's go learn something.
but usually the full answer to any question you'll have when it comes to operating and setting up a school. That's why he was invaluable at Schoolhouse.
Yeah, I bet. Well, this is good to know. So I'll definitely be hitting you up.
You're going to get a lot more emails now.
Sean, my price
Michael.
of doing this episode is you have to send us the follow-up of what happens from your morning email.
Okay, I'll be happy to. I'm
Put
not
it in
going
the
to
show
publish
notes.
this in the episode.
I'm just now curious and invested. Like, do they try to handle you? Do they confidentially say, hey, listen, we know we have a problematic teacher, but our hands are tied. Do they try to
We got
improve? Like, what
issues
happens?
with the district. Yeah, no, I'm really curious too, and it's interesting because we had not the same situation, but we had an issue with the teacher at Sora. They were completely responsive and dealt with it like that. Like it was instant, just right on top of it, and exactly the way a
should
school
leave that
should
in
be,
the
and not
episode.
just what's that?
You should leave that in the episode, and we'll
Leave that in the Well, I mean, it's a nice plug for them because they were completely responsive, and I won't say exactly what they did, but they handled it very seriously. They took it very seriously. It wasn't just, oh, you've complained, let's go fire the teacher. It was, okay, let's hear all of the problems so that we can deal with this well. And that's exactly what a school should be doing. And
Yeah.
the school that my fourth grader is at took the same initial approach, but it was through an email. I didn't have a conversation with them like I did at Sora. And I'm really curious to see how this all plays out now.
Yeah.
Because if it were me, I know how I would handle the situation. It wouldn't be just firing the teacher, but it would be exactly what you described. Okay, we need to sit down. We need to talk about, negative reinforcement and how to handle negative reinforcement and when that should be handled and why that shouldn't be the thing that's always happening. And we need to talk about other ways to manage a classroom than doing that for the slightest thing. And I won't go into all the details, but it's pretty egregiously misused in this case. And yeah, like you said, observation, feedback. We're going to be getting you a mentor who can really show you how this thing should work and all of that stuff. And I'm hoping that's what the school will do. And that is what I encourage the school to do. And we'll see what happens. So yeah, I will definitely follow up with you on that. And I'll put your email in the episode notes in case anybody wants advice like you gave to Brian, because that was great.
That's what I do. I just like ping Mike. I'm like, hey, I'm confused.
I got a question. All right, well, Mike, this was amazing. Just incredible
Thank you, sir.
thoughts on scale and process and management and all of that stuff. This was wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us here.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me on
great.
Ways We Learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, thank you for joining, and always keep learning. Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.